Usable power. What is it? Is it a myth? And most importantly, will it make you go bald? That and more coming up later in the video. But first, howdy all crankers, my name is Jeff, you are watching TrashWerks, and today we'll explain how motorcycles make their power, how that can affect your riding experience, and explain some things like, why does my 650cc not make as much power as that guy's Honda CBR 600RR? What's going on there? So stick around after the intro and we will dive right into it. So before we dive into our little power trip, something you might notice off the bat is I am not on the typical Kawasaki Z900 that I typically ride on. That is very astute of you. Very good job at noticing. This is a 2023 Triumph Bonneville Bobber, and if you'd like to see me do a review on this motorcycle, leave me a comment and I will get that cooking up for you. So before we get into the discussion of what usable power is, I think a good first place to start is explaining how motorcycles make their power. So when we're talking about a motor's power, there's going to be two primary metrics that we look at. One is going to be torque, the other is going to be horsepower.
Bruh.
Keep it on the road there, feller. So torque and horsepower can be pretty easy to confuse. In fact, for a long time, even me, the supreme authority on motorcycles, used to get confused about what the difference was between the two. And so I will go ahead and oversimplify this for you. That way, even our bike talker audience can follow along. Torque is the instantaneous amount of force that a motor can generate at a given time. Horsepower is the rate at which it can pump that force out. And so I'll give you some examples to help you understand what that feels like on a bike. Let's say you pull up to a stoplight. You're waiting there, you look over to your right, and there she is, the speed demon herself, Grandma in her 2004 pristine Honda Accord. You know what time it is. It's time to give her the beans. You and your 2006 lowered stretch clapped out Gixxer 600 is about to give her the thrill of her life. So you start revving up. You start getting ready to go. That green light comes on and you are off out of there, showing her exactly what it means to be the true apex predator of the road. And while you're doing that, while you first get off the line and feel that first push off the line, that is torque. You are feeling the torque of the motor pushing you off the line in that instant. Now, the next thing that you feel push you is Granny at the next light because she rear-ended you. She's basically blind at this point. Her kids really told her she shouldn't be driving, but she really likes her independence. So unfortunately, the speed demon claims another soul. Now, for horsepower, let's say you're cruising along the highway. Squirrel. Let's say you're cruising along the highway, and up next to you at 60, 70 miles an hour, you see it's a school bus full of kids. And despite not being allowed near schools, you can see them through the window. They are telling you, rev. You know, they want to see you fly by. You're the Mr. Cool guy on a motorcycle. So you drop two gears, do the worst impression of a tuck, and give her the old turbo twist. You start flying up 60, 70, 80, and that force you feel pulling you along, that's your horsepower. At least you feel it until you get to about 90 and then realize you're on an R7 and 100 miles an hour is going to be a tall ask. And so a common adage that old heads have been using for the longest amount of time is torque gets you off the line, horsepower gets you down the strip. And so now that we understand the two different metrics that we're going to hear when someone talks about power, a common term that you might hear someone use when describing power is the term peak power. Now, if you're looking for an example of peak power, you're looking at him, brother, right here. No, but really, peak power is just the maximum amount of power, whether it is torque, whether it is horsepower, that a motorcycle will make usually specified with what RPM that it makes that power at. For example, the peak torque of this machine, this Triumph Bonneville Bobber, is 78 pound-feet at about 4,000 RPM. And the peak horsepower is 76 horsepower at about 6,500 RPM. So that helps me understand where in the rev range, which if we look here, I can see I'm about 2,200 right now, I would need to be to get to that peak number. So if I wanted to squeeze out the most amount of power in a given time, that's where I would have to be. And that peak power is going to vary from motorcycle to motorcycle and from motor to motor. So for example, while on this bobber, I'm making 76 horsepower at about 6,500 RPM, on a Gixxer 600, you'll be making about 110 horsepower at about 13,000 RPM. So a pretty significant difference there. So peak power is the maximum amount of power that we're going to make at a specific point within the rev range. Now here's where my hot take comes in. Peak power is usually irrelevant. It does not matter. In most circumstances, usable power is going to be more important, because if you can't use that peak power, then it doesn't matter what it is. And I'll go over some stipulations on how exactly I've come to that conclusion. So first, let me define what usable power is. Usable power is the amount of power from your motor that you can actually apply to the riding that you're doing. There's going to be three factors that primarily limit how much power you can use in a given circumstance. So the first is going to be, what kind of riding are you actually doing? So let's say you live in a city where most of your riding is stoplight to stoplight. You've got maybe 1/8 of a mile in between. You're not really going to hit your peak power going from one stoplight to the next. It doesn't really matter there. Or let's say a lot of your riding is done on country roads, which you're going about 35 miles an hour, and at any point around a blind corner, there may be a tractor going 2 miles an hour. You're not really going to be blasting around at 13,000 RPM in those situations. So even though your Gixxer 600 has 110 horsepower at 13,000 RPM, it's not going to matter because you can't use it. Okay, and so the next factor that would limit the amount of power you can actually use, which is going to go a little bit hand to hand with the type of riding you're doing, would be the environment that you're riding in. Let's bring it back to the UK, where they really like their rain, and it rains 380 days out of the year. Well, in those wet conditions, you're not going to be able to put down the same 200 horsepower of your fresh leader bike that you would in the dry. And if we take things off the road and you're riding out in the dirt on some single track, that 160 horsepower of your KTM Super Adventure is not going to be as useful as it is on the road. Just ask anyone with their Yamaha Tenere or 450cc dirt bike how useful 160 horsepower is in the dirt. And the last contributing factor to how much power you can actually put down onto the road is going to be rider skill, and in parentheses, rider error. So let's say you're a 600cc rider and you short shift all of your shifts at 10,000 RPM for every pull that you do. Well, you're never making it to that peak horsepower. You're never making it to 13,000. Let's say you are a leader bike rider, and instead of getting your bike pointed to shoot off, you like to start cracking your throttle and ripping that thing open while you're still pretty leaned over, causing you to lose traction in the rear or for your rider aids to kick in. Well, you're never getting that peak amount of power. So a more important metric for your average rider will be the usable power, because peak power is only applicable to peak riders in peak conditions. And most of us can't tick both of those boxes. And wouldn't you know it, manufacturers who spend millions and millions and millions of dollars on research and development for their motorcycles and motors have thought about usable power when developing them. I'll give you an example. We'll look at two different models within the same line, both around the same amount of displacement. Our first bike, a Yamaha R7, which has about 70 peak horsepower at, I can't remember the range, I'll put it on screen, but it has 40 pound-feet of torque at about 3,000 or 4,000 RPM. Whereas if we compare that to our second bike, a Yamaha R6, it makes about 100 something odd horsepower at 13, 14 something odd 1,000 RPM, but it makes 44 pound-feet of torque, but way far at like 9,000 RPM. And so manufacturers look at what are these bikes being used for. Well, the R6 is used for the track. You're going to be at 9,000 and 13,000 RPM pretty frequently at a track, whereas the R7 is designed more for the road. Yes, it does have a lot of track capability, but at the end of the day, they're trying to sell those to road-going buyers. They don't really put a lot of effort into the 650cc twins racing class like they do their super sports. And so that R7, with more displacement but less horsepower than the R6, has that torque in a much more usable range. If you're on the road, how often are you at 9,000 RPM or 13,000 RPM? You're not really there that often unless your clutch is burnt out or you're just really mean to your bike. Now, let's look at how often are you at 4,000 RPM. You're there pretty frequently on the road. So if you're cruising around at 35, 45 miles an hour and you want to make a quick maneuver to, pass someone who's going slow, well, it's going to be a lot easier for you to access that peak torque at low speeds on the R7 than it will be for you in the R6. And so that's what usable power is. Power that you can actually apply to how you are planning to use the motorcycle. That's why you have all of these cruisers with a massive amount of low-end torque. It's because most people on cruisers cruise around at low RPMs at fairly low speeds, and they want power to be able to make maneuvers in those circumstances. And then you'll see sport bikes who have really top-heavy power. It's because they're meant for the track where they spend a lot of their time at the top end of their rev range. And so usable power is very prevalent when it comes to describing a bike's properties, a bike's power properties. And in fact, that's why you'll see a lot of sport bike riders, specifically 600cc's, who will re-gear, put different sprockets on their bikes so that they can get to a certain RPM at a lower wheel speed. They're trying to make that top-end power more usable for their street riding. So the next time you're posting online about how much fun you're having on your R7 or your Ninja 650 and some little 600 squidlet decides to chime in and let you know, oh, you don't have any top-end power, you wouldn't be able to keep up. Think of it this way. First gear on a Gixxer 600 takes them up to about 65, 70 miles an hour, depending on who you ask. Which means they don't get to that peak power until about 60 miles an hour. How often are you riding around at 60 miles an hour where you need to be able to tap into that power? If your enters not that often, well then there you go. While they might have more top-end power, they might have more peak power, they're not using it nearly as much as you would. So you can go on and continue having all the fun that you want on your little 650cc. But that about wraps it up for me here today on why usable power is more important than peak power. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment. I will try to get to those. I've quite frankly been a little inundated with the amount of comments that I've gotten. But if you did like the video and found it educational or at the bare minimum entertaining, then please like the video, subscribe, and if you want to find me on other platforms, I am on Instagram at trash.works, and I am on TikTok at TrashWerks. And I will leave you guys with a fun little hawk crank here. I will see you in the next one.